Our first presenters, Dr. Joseph Campbell and Dr. Danelle Shah, hail from MIT Lincoln Laboratory. Dr. Campbell leads the lab's Artificial Intelligence Technology and Systems Group, which creates algorithms, technologies, and systems for extracting information from multimedia data, including world-leading speech, speaker, and language recognition capabilities. Dr. Campbell is passionate about developing human network AI technologies that extract information automatically from speech, text, image, and video data, combined with network communications and activities to help the Department of Defense and law enforcement identify threatening or illicit activity on the surface and dark webs. He specializes in developing and transferring AI technologies for government applications and operationally relevant evaluation. Dr. Danelle Shah is an assistant group leader in Lincoln Laboratory's Artificial Intelligence Technology and Systems Group. Her research background is in machine learning, artificial intelligence, and human-machine interaction. Danelle joined Lincoln Laboratory in 2012 and has since been involved in a variety of programs focusing on pattern analysis and anomaly detection, multi-intelligence analytics for anti-access area denial, humanitarian assistance and disaster response, and open source data exploitation. She is a member of the IEEE, Society of Women Engineers, and the Military Operations Research Society. Now, without further ado, here to speak about the application of human language technology to combat misinformation, please welcome Dr. Danelle Shah and Dr. Joe Campbell. Danelle.
Thank you, Rob. Can you hear me? Can you see my slides?
Yep.
Oh man, okay, I was convinced I was going to break everything this morning. There's still time. My Wi-Fi is, of course, not very happy with me this morning, so hopefully we'll get through this smoothly. But thank you, Rob, for that introduction, and good morning, everybody. Thanks to Basis Technology and the HLTCon organizers for inviting me to speak today. Oh, my face just came up. Can you all still see my slides?
Yes, we can see everything.
Yep.
Okay. I don't know, I just saw a giant picture of my own face. It was very disconcerting. So as Rob said, my name is Danelle Shah. I work with Joe Campbell, who you'll be hearing from a little bit later, and we lead the AI Technology and Systems Group at MIT Lincoln Laboratory. If you're not familiar with Lincoln Lab, we're a federally funded research and development center in Lexington, Massachusetts, and we perform technology R&D in support of national security. Our group has been working in the HLT space for over 50 years, and over the decades, we've applied our deep technical expertise in audio, text, and multimedia exploitation to missions of national security. And you'll get to hear about some of them in a little bit more detail from Joe later. So this morning, I will be hopefully having a little bit of fun and talking about influence operations at a high level, talk about how we've been thinking about it at the lab, and discuss some of the challenges and hopefully some of the opportunities that it presents for us as human language technologists. Okay, this is my first next slide, just to confirm that my slides went ahead. I'm not paused.
Yes, in advance.
Stop asking for confirmation. Okay, great. So let's start with a case that we're all very familiar with right now, which is COVID-19. As you likely know, there has been no shortage of disinformation surrounding the pandemic, from conspiracies about the virus being developed by the US and released in China by the US military, to dangerous claims of false cures and treatments like drinking bleach, to my personal favorite, the Bill Gates microchip. And just last week, several Russian news outlets were accused of spreading disinformation about the effectiveness of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, presumably to prop up Russia's own vaccine, which it is very eager to distribute. Of course, state-sponsored influence campaigns have been waged around the world for literally millennia, with the goal of affecting attitudes, behaviors, and decisions to further one's interests and objectives. And while this is certainly not a new phenomenon, today's technology landscape, and especially social media, has enabled nefarious campaigns to achieve unprecedented scale, precision, and effectiveness. And as we've seen acutely, especially in the last decade, these influence campaigns can pose significant threats to national security, public health, financial markets, and undermine democratic processes and institutions. These activities are often waged in what we sometimes refer to as the gray zone, which means it falls below the threshold of military conflict, which makes it very difficult to counter. And the truth is that these activities can be extremely effective at influencing real attitudes and behaviors. And so I wanted to spend a few minutes discussing what goes into launching an effective influence campaign, because this will end up motivating what we need to do in order to counter them. And as it turns out, there's a $350 billion industry that we can look to for this success recipe. So if you go online and you do a search for how to make an effective advertisement, and of course the internet never lies, you'll get somewhere between 5 or 10 steps to developing an effective advertising campaign. And since I'm a Goldilocks girl, I'm going to call it 7, and it also fits onto my slide nicely. So these steps can roughly be mapped to the who, what, when, where, and why of the campaign. So first, why are you even making this advertisement? Probably because you want to convince people to buy the product or service. Who is your target audience? How are you going to reach your target audience, both in terms of the platform on which your audience will engage with your ad, as well as the theme and tone of the message that will strongly resonate with them. And only once you've determined the why, who, and how, should you start developing the what, the actual content that you plan to deliver. So, of course, there should be a constant feedback loop that I haven't explicitly drawn here, but you'll want to be measuring your results against your objectives and make adjustments if necessary. So this probably all makes sense and it's not surprising to anybody. It's probably pretty obvious, but I submit to you that we can think of influence operations in much the same way as we think about effective advertising. So I'll step through each of these very quickly. So first, we define our objectives in terms of the desired behavior that we hope to ultimately affect. And here I'm showing that we, notionally the good guys, as well as our adversaries, have certain objectives that we hope to achieve by influencing attitudes and behaviors. The example I gave at the top of the talk, it appears anyways that the objective of Russia and their state-sponsored news outlets was to undermine confidence in vaccines developed in the West in order to increase demand for their own vaccine. The next step is to understand the information environment, to understand the positions of your allies and your adversaries, and to identify your target audience. These are the people whose attitudes and behaviors we ultimately hope to influence, be it the general public, certain regional, socioeconomic, or ethnic subpopulations, or even specific individuals. And part of the market research will require you to understand what drives their beliefs, affinities, biases, behaviors, attitudes, and so on. In 2021, at least, digital platforms and social media are the go-to for reaching a wide audience, although it's important to note that that's not the only way. The actual message delivery could be through public and acknowledged means or covert and unacknowledged means, depending on the mission and objectives. And the important thing to remember is that the theme or narrative should be socially and culturally attuned to the target audience and might leverage a variety of common advertising techniques like presenting facts and figures, appealing to emotions, bandwagoning, eliciting shock and fear, and so on. Lastly, the actual content has to be produced and distributed, and as I mentioned, the effect is measured. So in the advertising world, focus groups are often used to determine what theme and content will resonate most strongly with the target audience before widespread campaign is launched. And it turns out that something very similar actually happens in the influence operations space as well. So many times before a false claim or a conspiracy theory or some other influence operation campaign makes its way onto a large social media platform like Twitter and Facebook to reach the large general population, it's often already been tested in small corners of the internet like Reddit and 8chan and even the dark web. And unlike traditional commercial advertisement, this can actually be done incredibly fast and very cheap. So there's almost no barrier to entry. Okay, so you might be asking, where am I going with all of this and where does the HLT fit in? So in order to detect and understand and ultimately combat an influence operation, we can think about roughly mapping these steps to a knowledge pyramid, which I'm showing here. And you've probably seen some form of this in one form or another. And the basic idea is that the more that we are able to enrich the data with meaning and content, the more knowledge and insights we're able to get out of it and the better decisions we can make. I took a little bit of artistic liberty here by not actually showing it as a pyramid, but you can see that the relative size of these blocks gets smaller as we go up, which qualitatively anyways represents the narrowing ability of our current technologies to perform these high-level tasks. So I'll step through each of these steps in a little bit of detail and explain maybe in a little bit more detail what I mean. So the first block of the pyramid is data and represents our ability to observe content, clean and structure the data, and answer the question, like, what is in this? And so this can include things like object detection in imagery, for example, speech to text for audio, maybe word count statistics in a document, and so on. And so these are certainly not completely solved problems, but the academic and commercial sectors have gotten very good at this data and content observation piece. The next block up involves interpreting what all of these words and objects actually mean by understanding relationships within the data. So here we want to understand what is actually being communicated. So for example, on the natural language processing front, this might include things like named entity recognition, event extraction, sentiment analysis, language translation, document summarization, and so on. Again, these are not solved problems. There's still a lot of work to be done, but there have been some really incredibly impressive advances in these capabilities in the last several years, particularly leveraging deep learning technologies, and we've been hearing about those in this conference this week. As we climb higher on the pyramid, we want to understand not only the content of what is being communicated, but what does it mean in context to the target population. And this requires understanding how it relates to things that might be outside of the immediate data. So we're not yet extremely good at this, but I have a couple examples here that I think maybe qualify as content in context. This one at the top, I really love. This is a demo of DALL-E, which is a GPT-3 model that is trained to generate images from text captions. So sort of the opposite of the automatic caption generation problem. So here you can enter a text prompt, and DALL-E will give you examples, image examples of that prompt. And one of the things it's able to do is combine unrelated concepts in plausible ways, like this armchair in the shape of an avocado. Now, I could get picky and point out that none of these chairs actually have arms, but this model has managed to combine the function of a chair and the aesthetics of an avocado in a way that the model has never actually seen before. This is actually really fun. I encourage you to play around with it in your own time. You can follow it. Hopefully you can see the link at the top there. There's a lot of really great examples of what this technology can do. I'm not sure how well you're able to see all of the text in the lower left block, but this image illustrates the evolution of the word Amazon over time in some word embedding space. And so notice that down at the bottom in 1993, the word Amazon is embedded nearby words like jungle and forest. And by 1998, it has shifted to a part of the embedding space near things like distribution and paragraph and publishers. In 2000, it has moved again to join words like Walmart, eBay, and e-commerce. And in 2016, the word Amazon has moved near content and Netflix and cable. And so this is a neat demonstration of a fairly straightforward capability of understanding the context of a word or concept as it evolves over time. And one could imagine that word embeddings are not only time dependent, but also socially and culturally dependent. Yesterday, Philip Blair gave a great talk about how we can use event extraction to automatically estimate information veracity by comparing to legitimate events that are reported by authoritative sources. And so this hairball that you can see on the lower right is a somewhat related approach published by some of my colleagues at Lincoln Lab, where they built a large Twitter graph where the nodes represented users, shared URLs, hyperlinks, and pre-extracted events. And the goal was to try to estimate the veracity of reported events. So how they did this is they first estimated a baseline credibility score for each node independently by analyzing its content and comparing its features to those that are known to be credible and non-credible. And then they subsequently refined these estimates by performing collective classification over the entire graph. And so the idea is that right? People who interact with credible sources are more likely to be credible themselves and to tweet about credible events. And similarly, if an event is reported by a non-credible source or shared by lots of non-credible users, then that event is less likely to be true. So this is a pretty intuitive concept, but the algorithm that performs this estimation takes the entire Twitter interaction graph into consideration and not just the content of any individual node. So these examples illustrate some capacity of integrating context understanding. And this is obviously still a very active field of research. Okay. So lastly, our holy grail, we want to be able to understand the intent and the impact of the data, of the campaign. So not just what was said or what it means in context to an audience, but what was the objective of the content creator and the impact that it had. And I certainly don't want to say that there's nothing that HLT can do in this space, so I do have a narrow little block here up at the top in wisdom, but this is really hard, right? And I'd actually argue that many humans are not very good at these top two blocks. So this graph that I'm showing on the bottom right is actually from a recent paper published by my colleagues at Lincoln, and what it's showing is a different Twitter graph, a Twitter subgraph of users who were active in the spread of a disinformation campaign during the 2017 French presidential elections. And the references at the bottom, I encourage you to check out the details in the paper. But the size of the nodes represent the estimated influence that each user had on the spread of the Macron leaks narrative over the network, and the color represents the node's similarity to other known IO accounts. And this could absolutely be a whole hour-long talk in and of itself, so I unfortunately cannot do it any justice today, but I do encourage you to check out the paper, and I'm happy to talk to folks offline about this as well. Okay, so I want to have a little fun and look at a few examples of how context is necessary for understanding intent. The first example I'm going to take from the advertising world. And this is an ad that aired in February during Super Bowl 55. Unfortunately, due to copyright, I had to remove all of the commercial screenshots and product references from my slides, but you can find this on YouTube if you do a search for it. So anyways, since I can't show the video, I'm going to kind of act this out for you. So the scene sets up with two women in what looks like maybe a building lobby, maybe an apartment complex. And there's a younger woman who walks up to the other and says, "I'm sorry I called you Karen," and hands her a bag of candy. And the second woman looks a little confused and looks at her and says, "My name is Karen." To which the first looks a little sad and replies, "I'm sorry, your name is Karen," and offers another bag of candy. So now let's assume that we can perform perfect speech to text and object recognition and just look at the information, the content of this ad. So we might be able to determine that there are two women, that they're talking. Maybe we can extract Karen as a named entity. Perhaps we can estimate that the overall sentiment of this dialogue is negative. And this is probably within reach of our capabilities today. But this doesn't really explain at all what this ad is actually communicating. The context of this ad is that, as probably everybody here knows, in 2020, the name Karen had been adopted as a pejorative term to describe a typically middle-aged white woman who is entitled and maybe even a little bit racist. So perhaps an adaptive embedding technique like what I showed earlier with the Amazon example might be able to capture this alternate meaning of the name Karen specifically in 2021 and specifically for an American audience. And so in light of this context, the knowledge that we can glean now is that the younger woman is actually apologizing for accusing the other woman of acting entitled or being unrealistically or unreasonably demeaning and demanding. And then there's also the sort of humorous recognition that it is probably very frustrating to be a woman named Karen in 2021. But what this ad is actually implying, the whole point of putting out this ad is to use very targeted humor to imply that sharing candy, and specifically this company's product, is a tension-cutting fig leaf that can ease even the most uncomfortable of social situations. And all of this is communicated in about 6 seconds and a dozen words. Let's look at another example, this time from a popular webcomic, which you are probably familiar with. And I'm going to show this for 2 reasons. First, I am physically incapable of giving a briefing without at least one XKCD comic. But second, and probably most importantly, political cartoons and memes, especially today, are extremely effective influence devices because they're entertaining, they're easy to share, and let's be honest, the old adage is true that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So in this example, there are in fact only 2 actual words, but say through a combination of HLT and computer vision technologies, we're able to extract the information of this comic, which is that there's a man standing in front of a crowd of people, and that one person in the crowd is holding a sign that says citation needed. Now, I like this particular comic, especially because you'd think that it was published fairly recently, maybe in the last few years, but it's actually all the way back from 2007. You can probably recognize this citation needed tag as coming from Wikipedia, which is what users can insert into articles and place after claims that are considered to be dubious or require some kind of proof or reference. So we can infer from this cultural context of Wikipedia and maybe from the stars and the flag on the podium that this is in fact a politician who is being accused of making a statement of questionable validity. Now, the objective of this comic is to use some culturally relevant humor to imply that politicians make false statements constantly and probably shouldn't be trusted, right? This isn't a particular politician, and this person isn't saying anything in particular, and yet a citation is needed. Okay, last one. And these are images you have probably seen before. These all come from the US Capitol riots earlier this year, and there was a significant amount of politically motivated misinformation that spread in the hours and days following this incident. One in particular, one claim was that Antifa, or more generally the violent political left, had infiltrated the group of Trump supporters to storm the Capitol and essentially make it look like the Trump supporter protesters were the ones who were committing this, and they were in fact not. So now, in some cases, like in the Washington Times example that I showed here on the right, this was said explicitly in words, but in many other cases, this was really just implied by making reference to things like hammer and sickles and BLM riots, and it turns out that's not a hammer and sickle, but it doesn't actually matter for the purpose of spreading this misinformation campaign. So these claims have been widely debunked as either misleading or outright false, but it has not stopped this narrative from continuing to spread. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, okay, Danelle, if I can detect or at least estimate that something is false, isn't that good enough, right? Does it really matter what the intent was? And this actually requires a much longer discussion and nuance that I don't have time for during my presentation today. I'm happy to take this offline. But at risk of oversimplifying things a bit, I want to take a quick detour to look at the spectrum of truth and intent. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because I'm already taking up all my time. So you may or may not be familiar with the character alignment chart, which I believe actually originated from Dungeons and Dragons. And it's gone viral recently by where people are assigning moral significance to everything from comic book characters to typefaces to how to slice a pizza. Anyway, the idea is that your alignment can be defined by 2 axes, good, evil, and lawful, chaotic. And in case you're wondering, I'm apparently lawful good, although given that I'm going over time, I might be going into the chaotic good territory today. So this is my slightly modified alignment chart that I totally made up and is not authoritative at all, that we can use to discuss different kinds of misinformation, different kinds of information. And here I've defined my axes to be good and evil, and truthful, deceitful. you can probably already see where I'm going with this. Here, I've attempted to place a variety of different types of information on this alignment chart. And again, this is just an exercise. It's not an authoritative ontology. It just helps to kind of think about this space a bit. So let's look at a couple of these. So over here on the top left is truthful good. So this is information that is authentic, factual, unbiased, transparent in origins, affiliation, and intent, right? It's all good and honest and transparent, and this is what we all want, right? And on the bottom left is deceitful evil, where I've placed disinformation, which is knowingly false or outright manufactured information with the intent to deceive or cause harm. And it can sometimes be easy to trick ourselves into thinking that these are the only two kinds of information that we care about or that we have to think about. But just for fun, let's look at a couple of these other boxes. So down here in the lower left is truthful evil, where I put malinformation, which is genuine information, but distributed with the intent to harm, such as private or revealing information. Perhaps this is unauthorized information that was hacked and leaked or collected without the subject's knowledge or permission. And depending on the situation, this can actually be extremely damaging and sometimes even illegal, regardless of whether the information is technically true. On the other side, in this upper right box, is what I like to call the Santa Claus corner. And this is false information that is distributed with good intentions, right? This is telling your friend that her haircut looks great when it really doesn't. And these are known as pro-social lies, and they're actually tied to empathy and compassion, and when used in moderation, are good and actually necessary for healthy relationship building. Okay, so this is probably a little bit more philosophical than I needed to get today, but I did want to drive home the point that just detecting truth is not going to be sufficient for detecting or combating malign influence campaigns. Okay, so that being said, let's get back to detecting truth. So the idea of inauthentic generated content is not a particularly new one, and in fact, there's a really fabulous art museum and sculpture park in my hometown that had an exhibit just last year called Truthiness and the News. And one of the pieces on display was this National Geographic cover from 1982, which is one of the earliest high-profile cases of digital photo manipulation. And you can see the cover here on the left, and the original picture, the original photo on the right, which was doctored to make the pyramids appear to be closer together in order to fit on National Geographic's first vertical cover. So this was actually considered pretty scandalous at the time, and the photo modification damaged the magazine's credibility for quite a while. And there were a lot of concerns at the time that this kind of digital photo manipulation was going to make it impossible for anyone to discern what was real, what was fake, and perhaps even lead to the demise of trusted journalism altogether. Sounds familiar. So today, there are many organizations and platforms that exist for the purpose of fact checking. And as you can see, each of these platforms have their own scales and categorizations for how they label truth. And of course, this in and of itself is a form of investigative journalism and is completely manual, which of course does not scale. And so you might be thinking, this sounds like a job for HLT. There are lots of current efforts focused on estimating truth from context by incorporating external evidence. And earlier I mentioned some of this work, especially this work on the left, about performing collective classification over events, users, and sources over an entire graph. You may be familiar with the DARPA semaphore and metaphor programs, which aim to automatically detect media manipulations, not just from the data itself, right? Not just from the pixels of an image, but also by incorporating physical and semantic knowledge and reasoning about the data integrity over all of those indicators. The paper that I'm showing here on the right by Professor and MacArthur genius, Regina Barzilay on MIT campus, is a bit similar to the work, again, that Phil Blair presented yesterday, in that they acquire and incorporate external supporting evidence to improve extraction accuracy. So event detection is not performed on a per document basis, but rather across the entire corpus. Okay, so I don't think that I'm allowed to give a talk about misinformation at a technology conference without at least mentioning deep learning and deepfakes. So I'm pretty sure I'm already over time, so I'm not going to actually play this video. But if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to check it out at moondisaster.org. This is a deepfake video out of MIT of President Nixon giving a speech that he never gave. And it's a pretty incredible example of how far automated video generation and voice conversion have come, especially with deepfake technology. So talking about deep learning, last couple of slides. So just a quick summary of some of the really cool things that the state-of-the-art deep learning algorithms like GPT-3 can do. I showed you the avocado chair earlier, but it can also generate anthropomorphized beverages. It can translate legalese into plain English. It can generate art and poetry and music and websites, and even produce somewhat socially conscious memes and much more. So really, really exciting time for deep learning and human language technologies. Of course, with great power comes great responsibility. And deep learning has become so impressively performant that it has been considered too dangerous to release into the wild, especially as it can be used to intentionally create hyper-realistic fake data at scale. On a slightly less nefarious but still concerning note, these models are trained on so much data in an unsupervised setting that they're still vulnerable to learning from bad or biased data and are not yet very good at handling illogical data. So I like this example of a question answer system powered by GPT-3 down on the bottom that thinks that my foot has two eyes. Okay, so wrapping it up, since I'm at time, I very easily could have talked about all of these things, talked about this topic for several more hours, but I'll just leave you with a couple final thoughts before turning it over to Joe. First, and this is probably obvious, but despite the title of my talk today, detecting misinformation is only one piece of the counter-influence operations puzzle. Detecting is not the same thing as combating. And as I discussed earlier, information doesn't have to be fake to be bad or harmful. Also, there's a whole social and psychological aspect of influence and information diffusion that has the unfortunate consequences of falsehoods spreading faster and farther than truth, and that people tend to spread, or at least tend not to stop, false or malign information, even if they know that it's wrong. And of course, at least in the US, it is generally not a crime to be wrong or even to intentionally lie or deceive. And so it can be very tricky to stop this from happening while protecting free speech. So I talked a bit about what HLT and sort of machine learning at large can do to detect and characterize influence campaigns and what we are not yet so good at. So in terms of directions that I think we as a community can focus on, we can leverage HLT to detect not only sentiment, but influence devices such as fear and humor and shock and bandwagoning. And I'm excited to see that I think one of tomorrow's presentations is going to be talking about emotion detection, which is certainly a part of this. We need to continue to improve our ability to incorporate cultural and social context in order to understand how the content is relevant to specific target audiences. We can estimate credibility by automatically identifying external supporting evidence, as long as we can assume that that external evidence is also true, which is a whole nother talk. I didn't talk about it at all today, but I think it's going to be a very long time before technology is really good at doing that part of our knowledge pyramid. And so we have to think about how to build systems that can leverage what technology is good at and enable and empower human operators and users to effectively interrogate the data and find information that they should care about in order to perform those higher level contextual functions. Lastly, and I think, again, there's another talk tomorrow morning, which I think is going to talk a little bit about this. We have a tendency to think about combating misinformation by just finding it and somehow squashing it. But as I just mentioned, this is actually pretty ineffective and in some ways can be counterproductive. So we need to start thinking about, in turn, focusing to building resilience and resistance to malign influence, as opposed to just reacting to what's already out there. And this is sort of, analogous to hand washing and mask wearing, or even better, vaccines, instead of just waiting until folks show up to the hospital and need to be treated. Okay, so that is officially the end of my part of this morning's talk. Thank you very much for your attention. I apologize for the fire hose. I'm very excited to answer some questions after Joe's section. And I will pass now to Dr. Joe Campbell, who's going to bring us back down to earth a little bit and talk about some of the great technologies that we've been developing at MIT Lincoln Laboratory for this mission. So thank you again. And
we're seeing Joe's presentation. We're good.
Oh, perfect. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Danelle, for this really great introduction to the misinformation problem and motivating it. And I also want to thank Rob for such a nice introduction at the beginning. It's an honor to be invited by Basis Technology to share this keynote with Danelle. I'm Joe Campbell, and I'm here to describe technologies to combat misinformation, in addition to some other work we do in my group. First, let me introduce MIT Lincoln Laboratory. So we are a federally funded research and development center. We are managed, organized by MIT. We're employees of MIT. Our laboratory is 12 miles away from the MIT campus. We're located in Lexington, Massachusetts. Our mission is developing technology in support of national security. We have roles in architecture, technology, and prototyping. The laboratory is grouped into 11 mission areas. The newest one being over there on the right, the biotechnology and human systems area. That's where we transitioned our language learning and where that now resides. My group is over in the cybersecurity mission area, and let me describe that a little bit. So we are part of Division 5 at Lincoln Laboratory. You know, in true MIT style, everything is numbered. We have 4 different cyber groups in Division 5, and we also have the Lincoln Supercomputing Center. My group there is in the top middle. We focus on artificial intelligence technology and systems. And this is the group that Danelle and I run together. So our group, being numbered, is also known as Group 52. And we are built on this foundation of machine learning, human language technology, information processing, et cetera. We have a very strong, rigorous evaluation culture, which Doug Reynolds' keynote yesterday touched upon, doing data-driven evaluation and research and evaluation. We also publish quite a bit from my group at premier conferences. Our 3 main technical pillars include identity detection. Among other things in that pillar are speaker and face recognition, for example. In the middle pillar, communications analysis. This is looking at the content of communications, enhancing speech, enhancing audio, transcribing speech, translation of speech or translation of text, search and retrieval, summarization. Over on the right, we have our human network exploitation area. This is focused on understanding human networks, including determining their leadership, discovering organizations, and linking actors across platforms and persona analysis. And I'll be getting into that a little bit later with an example. On top of all this, we support our sponsors' mission applications in identity intelligence, illicit network disruption, influence operations, as Danelle has been describing, adversarial AI, et cetera. And with all this, we design, deploy, evaluate robust AI and systems and analytics in operational environments. So this rigorous evaluation I'm talking about, when we have our way, is done on real data, the operational data. Our division conducted a multi-year study in AI and machine learning, And as Doug Reynolds described in his keynote yesterday, machine learning is all about the data and its annotation and incorporating user feedback, et cetera. So let me just walk through this briefly. We begin on the left with structured and unstructured data sources. These structured data sources might include data that comes from cellular networks, et cetera. In the sources box there, we're talking about unstructured data, which, one source is social media. Wikipedia is a great source. There's a whole bunch of these together, and these not necessarily be in English language. In fact, most of our sponsors aren't concerned so much with English. And the first block is the data conditioning block. This includes what you're probably familiar with as ETL, extract, transform, and load. You might also be doing semantic embedding. And this is the block that often is overlooked, but sadly, well, overlooked isn't the right word, de-emphasized in importance is what I mean. And this tends to be the block where people spend most of their time. There's a big DARPA D3M program working on solving that. That's just concluding now. If you're interested, please contact me about that. In the middle is where a lot of us focus on, machine learning. Depending on how you count, there's 3 major categories for machine learning between supervised, unsupervised, and reinforcement learning. And then there's more than a dozen subcategories. So there's all sorts of machine learning research that has really blossomed in the last decade. But it has a very long history, in fact, going way back to the early days at MIT and at Lincoln Laboratory at the dawn of AI. Then the systems that we develop almost always have a human user. Occasionally we develop systems that are meant for machine consumption, but even those typically downstream will have a human user at the end. And this human machine teaming component is critical to having systems that not only have high performing machine learning algorithms, but also meet the needs of the users and combine with the user to form an effective team. And at the end of this is insight that can be applied in various user missions. I've shown just a few examples here on the right, including intelligence analysts, medical diagnostics, our micro UAV Perdix, which you might have seen the swarm of 100+ micro UAVs on 60 Minutes a couple of years ago, self-driving cars, etc. Then the computing foundation that this is all built on with these very big data processes, we're firmly in the GPU area, and in some cases, some organizations are moving beyond that to tensor processing units, etc. And that'll keep accelerating and allow us to develop even more compute-hungry algorithms. And a foundation for all this that must be emphasized is the need to develop robust AI systems. This can include explainable AI, metrics and bias assessment, etc. But I want to emphasize over on the right the need for to incorporate ethics, and not only from the AI and machine learning designers, but people who establish ethical guidelines and policies. They also need to understand how machine learning works, what it can and cannot do. And then just this month, the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence released their final report. And this is an amazing effort, over 700 pages. I'm showing just a little thumbnail of it in the upper right corner and the link there at the bottom of the slide. And you can download my slides and click on these links from the HLTCon website. So my group expanded from a human language technology group to an artificial intelligence technology and systems group a few years ago. It turns out both HLT and computer vision are such challenging problems that we were all doing machine learning and AI before it was called that. So we have over 5 decades of history developing human language technologies such as language ID, speaker and speech recognition to our US government sponsors. Of course, natural language processing is one cornerstone of HLT, but often called out separately, as I've done here. For example, concept extraction. Another area, cross-language information retrieval, is another highlight in our group. Being able to treat multilingual data as if it's English, for example. Multimedia triage, being able to take videos, images, and audios and cluster them together in a way that users can very quickly go through large sets of multimedia data. A lot of times there's an urgent need to get through a lot of data quickly. A great example of that was in the Boston Marathon bombing. Then we, on the bottom row, data enrichment, being able to do template matching, extract topics from conversations, and then skipping one over, discovering organizations in large graphs, and then fake content detection. These are all elements that can be used in combating misinformation or shaping the information space. And finally, I want to emphasize there the green highlight on online persona linking. So that, let me just talk briefly about that. I think I'll skip through it pretty quickly because I want to save some time for the Q&A. But the basic concept is we want to understand if different personas or users are the same person. And one example where this is a real problem is on dark web marketplaces. So each user will have a profile. They'll have a number of dark web forums that they're members of, and they will have connections to other users. So in the diagram here, I'm showing @hacker in forum A and also @hacker12 in forum B. And a question is @hacker and @hacker12 the same person? So we do this through multiple tiers. Here I've shown just 3 of them. There's actually more. And we'll train models. We'll take pairs of those profiles and we'll do profile similarity, which models a person's profile information, their speech, if there's audio, their face, etc. We will also model the content of their communications, for example, doing author identification, and then look at network similarity. And from that, we'll build a fused classifier. And the idea is to model who they self-report they are, what they talk about, and whom they talk about it with. Those are those 3 blocks. So now in the recognition phase, I want to score models on test data pairs. So looking at profile similarity, I have robust name matching, categorical information, and such as locations in their profile, the time their profile was created, and if they have a photo in their profile, face recognition. In block 2 on the content similarity, I'll use author ID on lexicographical features. In fact, yesterday there was an excellent talk from BASIS illustrating locality sensitive hashing. That's what we use for very fast text analysis for author ID. And we also include stylometry. So this is the use of not only emojis, but unusual punctuation and spacing in some of these advertisements. And then finally, on network similarity, looking at community membership, the idea is our friends can reveal who we are, and we'll embed each user into a community vector space. So here I'm showing a few examples. Well, I tried to show them. Our release review process was not amenable to showing the actual data, which I've intentionally blurred. It's not your screen. And the idea is in looking at some profile similarity matches, as you could obviously see if they weren't blurred out, there's some similarity in the names or handles on the different forums, but they're the kind of similarity that's a struggle to determine algorithmically. So this requires some pretty advanced analytics. Next, we look at the content of the matches, and over in Forum A, this user Marcus posted content related to denial of service attacks, and that's written in English. Over in Forum B, which happens to be a Russian forum, the user Stelios posted in Russian pretty much the same ad offering their services for hire to help eliminate, as he called it, your pesky competition by running denial of service attacks against your competitors' websites, and they are more than happy to do that for you for a fee. Finally, we have example topics of network similarities. So here we're looking at topic words determined through automatic clustering using PLSA. So you can see here that there's a whole variety of different information sources. As you might expect, none of them by themselves perform perfectly well. So the idea is, what can we do together? And you can also combine additional information, as I mentioned at the beginning. These are just 3 information streams. As I'm showing at the bottom of the slide, we developed and open sourced a whole suite of toolboxes that are being used here, and they're on our publicly available GitHub. So one question is, well, how accurately can we match users who are the same person across dark web markets? Are 2 sellers in weapons forums the same person? Here are the example on the left. So what I'm showing at the bottom left is a receiver operating characteristic curve. And this is a 2-class detection problem. And there's 2 true trial pairs where the pair of users is in fact a match, it's the same person, and false trial pairs. So we run this evaluation, actually DARPA ran this evaluation. The axes on this plot are false positive rate or false alarm versus true positive rate or a hit. And the ideal performance curve hugs the upper left-hand corner and would have an area under the curve equal to 1. The dashed diagonal is a random classifier which would have an area under the curve of 0.5. The actual performance curve of the system we developed is shown in blue, and that's obtained by varying the detection threshold to sweep across the experiment. And as you can see, our system performs much better than random. It's at 0.71 for the area under the curve. And this happened to be the best performance of all the systems in the DARPA evaluation. And in this case, Hyperion Gray partnered with us on this. Now over on the right, let me show a related problem for illegal drug markets. Here the question is, are the sellers in these drug markets the same person? So here again, we have a different representation. I'm just showing the area under the curve as a simple scalar metric for 6 different systems in this bar graph. And the Lincoln Laboratory system finished in 2nd place in this DARPA evaluation, but all is not lost. Our locality sensitive hashing system was instrumental in the system that outperformed us. So in a way, we also contributed to that. Next, I want to show a bigger experiment on an open source challenge, looking at whether a Twitter user and an Instagram user belong to the same person, are the same person. So here we had 250,000 users, 500,000 hashtags, and 1 million user mentions. And the idea is, again, I want to do a detection or verification experiment on pairs of users to answer, is this pair the same person or not? And as you can see in the, this is a different representation than I showed in the previous plot. This is a detection error trade-off curve, and the ideal performance curve hugs the lower left-hand corner. This visually doesn't look so great, but this is plotted on the normal deviate scale, so it's almost logarithmic. So there's accentuated separation between the curves to show differences between systems. So this, and what I'm showing there are multiple systems. As we approach the lower left-hand corner, the performance is improving. And as you might expect, adding more information sources, like I was showing those 3 channels previously, increases the performance if you're able to do the fusion well and robustly, because remember, in the real world, not all of this data always exists for each user. So the system has to be robust to missing data. And we achieved a 5% equal error rate. What does that mean? It means that when our system says a pair of users is a match, it's correct 95% of the time. And likewise, if it says it's not a match, it's correct 95% of the time. So this is quite useful in a variety of applications. So this was just a very brief introduction to what you can do with a suite of our analytics. I've referenced a paper there at the bottom that describes our whole stack of tools that we open sourced. So let me just go forward from here, and I'm happy to answer detailed questions on any of this later. I don't want to run out of time, but I want to conclude by telling everybody here that we run this annual workshop called Recent Advances in AI for National Security, or RAINS as it's abbreviated. And it's coming up in November. We don't know yet if it will again be virtual, but last year we had 625 registrants. And we also ran it jointly with the Human Machine Collaboration Workshop. And our goal is to really build a community of AI researchers, practitioners, and users and discuss and share ideas on trends, etc. So if you're interested in that, please contact me or our friends at Basis. I'm sure they'll put you in touch. And with that, I'll stop there. Sorry, we're just a few minutes over time. Hope there's still time for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Danelle. That was terrific. And we have a couple of actually quite a few questions here, but we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. All right. So the first question goes to Danelle. And I want to go back to the topic of fostering influence resilience, what you mentioned. What measures could we use to determine what groups are maybe most vulnerable to influence, as perhaps adversaries might do? If somebody's trying to pick a channel to go and deploy an influence op, they're going to try to pick the best channel for it. What measures then might we also apply to make those groups more resilient?
So that's a great question. I'm not sure that I'm going to have a very concise answer. I think, so a lot of it is, it depends. Part of it is, again, understanding sort of the cultural and societal significance of, what it actually means for somebody to be vulnerable to a campaign anyways. Like, why would those people even be targeted? Which might not be something that comes from the data itself, but you would just sort of, know from your understanding and context of, of the population and the campaign. I think from a resilience point of view, this is something that actually, a lot of, for example, Eastern European countries have been a lot better at giving their citizens, tools and, internet literacy in order to just make them generally more resilient to, or encourage them to recognize recognize fake news or recognize manipulative content, especially since many of them are right next door to Russia. So, they're kind of used to being targeted all the time. I think we can learn a lot from what some of those countries have been doing that have absolutely nothing to do with, detection of anything that's happening on social media, and, and in fact starts very young, right? Like, this is, having elementary school children understand, media literacy and civics and stuff like that. So that's absolutely not the question that was being asked. But I think that's something that at least we as a country need to be investing a little bit more in.
That's great.
And I know the question was actually about data and metrics, and that is at least part of what I made very brief reference to a program that we had where this was the one with the French elections, the 2017 French elections, where the purpose of that work, and again, that I could go for an hour just talking about that, but I won't. So I encourage you to look at that paper. The point of that was to quantitatively, using rigorous statistical analysis, determine the influence that a particular node has on, the spread of information. And similarly, you can use a lot of the same math to estimate the receptiveness of a node to particular kinds of information. It's really fascinating. It comes off the heels of, one of our recent PhD grads in Harvard statistics who did a lot of work in graph causal inference. So it's really fascinating. I'm sorry, that's probably not a sufficient answer for the time that I have today.
If only we had more time to talk about it. This has been
so you
great.
Can contact me, I'll talk your ear off.
I'll take you up on that. Joe, I do want to get a quick one in from you. As nefarious actors are moving into different networks and trying to establish their credibility or trying to feel out a spot where they might want to, do an influence op, how are we, what measures or what things might we be looking for where they might be testing the waters for receptiveness, or where they might be, doing very subtle things to establish their credibility before they turn up the volume and really start blasting out? What can you share about that?
Yeah, so some of our earliest work in this area was on this CT snare program, and that was social network and intent recognition and countering that. And one of the models we developed was a typical process where let's call them the adversaries, begin with acquiring resources, capital, people, actors. Then they might move to the next phase where they're casing the joint and understanding where its vulnerabilities might be, and possibly even rehearsing their operation. And finally, then they execute their operation. And the idea is, if you can build models to understand this kind of progression of an attack as one example, then you have some means to, based on previous attacks from data sets from, for example, Sam Houston University that studies these attacks in detail and annotates data from a variety of open sources. This gives you an opportunity to try to react before something really bad happens. And the same kind of approach can be used in a variety of scenarios, whether it's a bombing or a massacre or a social media disinformation campaign intended to cause harm. One of my favorite examples is Brad Parscale, the digital campaign manager in the election before last, had a very elaborate approach for testing the waters with different variations on social media meant to recruit and mislead people. Things as subtle as changing the color schemes and doing so in concert with the time of year. It was both evil and brilliant. And there's no reason why we shouldn't be considering the same kinds of things.
Well, thank you
I'll
very
stop
much.
there. I could go on forever. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Joe. Thank you, Danelle.